I just want to welcome everyone. Firstly, circumstances are different today than they may ordinarily have been if it was a week ago, but this is where we're at. Look, firstly, I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, which I meet today, which is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also the traditional custodians of the land in which you all meet. And we are in different parts of the country, some of us, so particularly in different parts of the state for us in Victoria. Susan Davies will be here to co-moderate shortly, all things going the way they should. But firstly, I'd like to apologise on behalf of Tony Pearce, the Inspector General of Emergency Management, who, as we can understand, is tied up in talks behind scenes around how Victoria progresses into the imminent lockdown. And that's not my call, that's the call of the press at the moment. But and decisions like that are being made on the run, and they're being made now at 10:30. So, and Tony rang early this morning and said that it's still on his agenda, and if he can get a chance to pop in, he will. So we'll play it as we go. The panelists I'd like to introduce, and also encourage people to contribute on the chat, and also the Q&A. If you have questions on the Q&A box, would be the best place to put them, and we'll have a look at the questions as we go, and pose some questions at the end of the session. Our Gender Justice in Disaster Inspiring Action second last session. We've been running through Tuesdays and Thursdays through May, and this is by no means, well, we wanted to end strong, so this is a strong ending for us, and our panellists today are case in point. So welcome Carmel Flynn, the Acting CEO of Bushfire Recovery Victoria. Catherine Connelly is a researcher regarding Black Summer from WIRE, the Women's Information Referral Exchange. Eeva Grunden is someone I met throughout the course of Black Summer in Mallacoota. She's a place manager and a community advocate, amongst many other things, in Mallacoota. And Shona Whitton. Shona, we met during training throughout the course of Black Summer as well. And Shona is the National Coordinator of Operations at Australia Red Cross. Further information about these awesome women can be found on our speaker profile page in correlation to the program on the GADPOD portal. I would like to say that particularly introducing Carmel is not so much an honour. I don't know if she would cringe at a word like that, but as a foundation member of the Gender and Disaster Task Force in 2014, where I first met Carmel, it was great to have someone of such calibre with such expertise in the field of of emergency management, particularly in your role at DHHS at the time, Carmel, and the fact that you're still in the space and leading Bushfire Recovery Victoria is awesome. So I'd like to throw to you. We know what the gig entails today. We're going to say a little bit about ourselves and what our roles are, and particularly the subject matter of the session today, which is to do with gender inclusion, which is the theme around the whole gig, basically. But a little bit of background and a little bit about how the Black Summer period affected the communities that you all came in contact with from a gendered point of view as well. So I'll throw it to you, Carmel, first up.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to Susan and also to the Conference Planning Committee for having me. It's a privilege to join you today to discuss bushfire recovery and how gender has factored into that. And you've done a perfectly fine job of introducing me, so no need to do more of that. I only have 5 minutes, and in that time, there are really 3 points that I'd like to cover. So firstly, to set the context for today, I thought I'd briefly touch on the impact and consequences of the 2019-20 fires in Victoria. And then secondly, I'd like to impress the importance of a recovery agency appreciating a gender perspective in its own organisation, as well as supporting communities. And then thirdly, I'll talk to how Bushfire Recovery Victoria has factored gender into our service delivery and my observations of some pretty inspiring women coming to the fore in community recovery. So in the context of the fires, the 2019-20 bushfires, which of course traversed the whole eastern seaboard through to and including South Australia, have been described as the worst in Australia's history. And they were exceptional in both size and impact. in Victoria, the consequences that were devastating and they were far-reaching on people's health and well-being, on buildings, fences, bridges and roads, Aboriginal culture and country, local and regional economies, and on our environment and biodiversity. And we know that recovery from these fires will take many, many years. When Bushfire Recovery Victoria, and from here on in, I'll use our acronym BRV, was stood up in January of last year as a dedicated and permanent agency to coordinate recovery efforts. At that time, families and communities were still in survival mode. BRV's early focus was on listening to people and understanding their immediate needs. We established community recovery hubs staffed by local people, and we partnered with state, federal and local governments to establish support services. And it was only 2 months on from the worst of the fires that the global pandemic disrupted our way of life. It's a bit déjà vu today, and dealt another blow to communities, which at that time were really just beginning their recovery journeys. A lot of people seeking connectedness in the wake of trauma instead found themselves isolated, and BRV really had to rewrite how we facilitated recovery coordination. And whilst the pandemic presented challenges for service delivery, since then, all through that time, we continued to work directly with local communities to continue to support and empower them to lead their own recovery at their own pace. Which brings me to how BRV as a recovery agency operates and how we consider gender. We've got a real commitment to inclusivity at our core. BRV's fundamental principles include empathy and community care and collaboration. And these are all traits which would be considered softer skills in working environments and in professional leadership roles. Pippa Malmgren and Chris Lewis, in their book called The Leadership Lab, Understanding Leadership in the 21st Century, write about the essential leadership characteristics you find in successful organisations that work and operate within dynamic environments. And they highlight the importance that at every level of a successful organisation, not just the CEO, but every employee displays the traits of what is known as servant leadership, being humble and honest, compassionate and empathetic, and putting the team ahead of personal ambitions. And so it's not surprising to me that BRV has attracted women to come and work with us. A healthy majority of our workforce are women, and women make up 60% of our executive directors and hold 65% of management positions. And although I don't assume all of our motivations from my personal experience, I've gravitated towards working in BRV and working in recovery environments for more than 15 years, largely because of the values instilled in me by my mother to be of service of others, particularly those who are suffering and in need of care and compassion. So what have we learned from community recovery following the fires? Well, we know that disasters don't impact everyone in the same way. The way people and communities are experiencing recovery is shaped by their socioeconomic experience, their culture, their background, and of course their gender. And we understand that's why it's really important for service delivery in recovery to respond to gender. For example, we know that incidents of violence against women increases during and after disasters, and that's why we're funding initiatives that aim to prevent and respond to gender-based violence and promote gender equity in bushfire-affected regions, and why we're investing in gender-informed training for service providers and our own staff. We've seen also, though, a real emergence of women as leaders of recovery in their regions. There are 22 community recovery committees convened across East Gippsland and the northeast of Victoria. And of these 22 recovery committees, 13 of them are chaired by women. And following this trend, almost 60% of community recovery committee members are women. And community recovery committees are strong and independent voices to government, and they develop community plans that set the agenda for their district's long-term local recovery. Community consultations conducted by Victoria University found that women leaders, like those steering recovery through our community recovery committees, are seen by community members as pillars of strength. And it's not difficult to see why this is. They're women from all walks and stages of life who've come together to nurture their community back from disaster, who continually put their caring responsibilities, their work, and occasionally their own well-being on the line for others. And that's really clear in the communities that we're working with. And I'll just mention a couple of inspiring women that I've met in bushfire affected communities over the past year. Jen Smith is one of the chairs of our community recovery committees. She's the chair of the Clifton Creek Community Recovery Committee. But that's just one of the hats that Jen wears. She's also a primary producer, a postgrad student, a wife, a mother, and a member of the East Gippsland Women in Agriculture. Jen and her family were directly impacted by the fires, and she's been a passionate advocate for her community's recovery, leading her committee through consultation with their community and the development of their recovery plan. And it's not just in community recovery committees where women's leadership is providing confidence and compassion for communities. When I was traveling through the Northeast last year, I had the opportunity to meet Alice Albert. She and her husband lost their home and much of their 700-acre property in Cudgewar, and it had been her husband Greg's family home for several generations. Despite her own trauma, Alice volunteers for the Red Cross. She's a member of the local tennis club, where she still, on a weekly basis, bakes and delivers a sponge cake from the oven of her temporary modular home. And another key role that she's played is in supporting her husband, who stayed to fight the fires. Alice has maintained strong ties with her mostly looking at how they support the men in their community, many of whom stayed, like Alice's husband Greg, to fight the fires and are still coming to terms with the trauma of losing their homes, their livestock, and their livelihoods. So just in conclusion, BRV considers it a privilege to be on this journey with our communities. We value and celebrate the work that they're doing to lead their own recovery. We're very committed to building relationships and trust with the communities we serve and to empower them in their recovery and to be with them for the long haul. And to do this successfully, we know we need to understand the importance of gender engagements and in recovery programming. And this is a lot easier to do if we're a recovery agency that models inclusivity and that leverages the strengths of the women in our workforce and in our community, including affirming our often natural alignment to leadership characteristics such as empathy, care, and collaboration. Thanks, Steve, back to you.
Thanks, Carmel. I often muse about the fact that so often people talk about, and then they put a bit of a caveat on what they say when they talk about women in the emergency management sector by saying, but it doesn't matter that they're women, it just matters that they're capable. And the fact that they're women is just a side point because we have good operators at all different levels. So I love the fact that unashamedly you celebrate women in the sector. And one of the comments that I will comment on in the Q&A isn't a question, but it talks about your leadership and the fact that you forged that sort of setting for women to come in, particularly in an organisation like BRV, where my views are my own views at this stage, but where there was a big gap in what the response organisations in their capability was the lack of space in the recovery setting. So having an organisation like BRV is so important because it gives response-focused organisations, a focal point after the incident and when we move through the recovery, which we know is long-term. And we know that after a year and a half, that there's still people suffering. But so eloquent and so to point, Carmel, and it's just great because we'll come back and we'll have a little bit more to say later on. based on Tony's absence, but we've got a little bit extra time. Susan has joined us and she's not well at all. The image of her coughing is enough for me not to throw it to her, but she's asked if I could just step into her place and thank you, and then introduce Catherine as well. So Catherine Connelly is a researcher. Catherine, if you could give us a bit of a rundown about Wire's work, and then certainly what you found out to be economic support or not for women and families throughout the Black Summer.
Sure. If I could get my slideshow up. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. I'm Catherine Connelly. I'm working on the Gender Disaster and Financial Capability Project for Wire. Next slide, please. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm calling from the unceded lands of the Gadimanad people of the Eastern Maar Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and all Aboriginal people gathering here today. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Next slide, please. So I work for Wire, which is the Women's Information and Referral Exchange. Our organisation is a free support line, walk-in centre and project-based organisation which centres the experiences of women, gender non-binary and gender diverse people. I'm speaking today on gender disaster and economic security for women, looking at how gender factors into economic recovery for disaster, specifically for Black Summer. I'll go into details about my project, but to answer the question of the panel briefly, Black Summer's bushfire recovery, where is it at and how did gender factor? My answer from an economic point of view is slow. Recovery is slow and complex. Recovery issues are interconnected and compounded by COVID. In terms of gender, women experience economic inequality throughout our culture at all times, and this is highlighted in the disaster event, as well as the aftermath. The impacts can last for years or a lifetime in some cases, which is why we are doing the work of my current project on gender disaster and financial capability. So this is a one-year project funded by Bushfire Recovery Victoria via the Office for Women. And our role for this is to engage and learn from lived experience of women financially impacted by Black Summer and the financial counsellors and financial capability workers that have been working to support them. So just briefly, the brief for the project is to develop and deliver gender responsiveness training for financial capability workers, focused on providing an increased awareness of barriers for economic security for women before, in and following disasters such as bushfire, along with what workers can do to address the barriers in a gender-sensitive, strength-based and trauma-informed way. I do this work with the understanding that man-made impacts of climate change will increase the frequency and ferocity of disaster events such as Black Summer, and that women and girls, along with First Nations people globally, suffer disproportionately from the effects of environmental degradation and climate change. Next slide, please. So in terms of women and economic security in disaster, we've heard a lot in this great conference about the impacts of gender, particularly around safety, gender roles and safety, and the increase of family violence after disaster. But this project focuses on the slightly less research, but very real impacts of gender inequality in women's economic security before, during and after disaster. We're seeing more work and consciousness about feminist economics as a result of COVID, which is great and which Wire really welcomes. But we want to note that for women in recovery zones, COVID has not only increased the emotional stress and burden of the bushfires, but also obviously the financial burden and indeed lengthened the financial strain in many instances. I just want to be clear that gender non-binary and gender diverse people also experience economic marginalisation. However, this project does not examine the financial lives of gender non-binary and gender diverse people as separate experiences to those discussed here, as this merits its own work and research to speak to the particularities, strengths and challenges for those gender identities. I and Wire welcome further work and research into this area. So we know that women are incredibly resourceful with money when empowered with financial capabilities and access to adequate income and choices. But we also know that for women in disaster affected areas, they can be financially negatively affected from a range of impacts. And this includes the gender division of labour, both in overrepresentation in paid work in underfunded industries, and also in unpaid caring roles. The loss of assets and income, not only via a bushfire event, but also in the months and years afterwards in the recovery. Issues around underinsurance, unfair division of assets and income in and after relationships, particularly as Carmel flagged instances of intergenerational farms and the complications there. The limits of economic and employment opportunity in rural and regional areas. The economic downturn, especially for farming communities, small businesses, which are often run by women, and tourist areas. And all of these factors are compacted with an intersectional view when the barriers women are experiencing are compounded with racism, ableism, homophobia, ageism, or family violence, to name a few. Next slide, please. So the learnings of the project are vast, but I just want to touch on a couple of them here. So through both research and engagement directly with lived experience advocates and financial counsellors, we know that economic inequality doesn't just arise because of the disaster, but is compounded by it. Poor economic security for women in disaster beforehand will see this replicated and accelerated in and after the disaster. The financial impact is rarely a one-off event based only on the loss of an asset, but will continue longer term with loss of income, employment, and markets. As we have seen in Black Summer, disasters can also be compounding. So it's not that one disaster has a single event, but those disasters are rolling. So I'm quite short on time. So if we could just go to the next slide. I just want to briefly touch on some of the big issues that are coming up. They're listed thematically there and you can have a look. But basically, in terms of economic insecurity, employment, we know that there's an increase for women in unpaid care work in the home and in the community after fires. We know that women become more vulnerable financially and physically due to a lack of knowing their financial rights, legal rights, and ability to leave domestic violence situations. Next slide, please. Insurance. I'm so glad it's been talked about in this conference already, but it's critical for all genders, as is understanding the policy. For women, there's a lack of insurance or underinsurance. And I guess one of the most important things is the complications and overwhelm. So with a trauma-informed practice lens, we're really aware that people in these situations have so much information coming at them and so much emotion, and it's very hard to fight a negative or unfair insurance decision if you're in that overwhelmed state. We also know that housing is a major issue with a lack of affordable housing in an already oversaturated market, which is then at breaking point, basically, when houses are lost and communities are trying to stay within their own town. Next slide, please. Women can be slow to seek support because they, from financial counsellors, because of a lack of knowledge of that role in the culture, but also because they think other people have it worse off than them. But when they do so at much higher rates than men, with most reports from financial counsellors say that 70 to 90% of their callers are women. Money and mental health is an ongoing issue, of course, and you know, there's so many mental health issues around the recovery from disaster, but the financial ones have a particular flavour, of course. And again, with reduced bandwidth due to trauma, you have issues of accumulating debts, etc., placing a lot of strain economically on people. Next slide, please. So what helps through our research? The project is focusing on the kind of economic preparedness that is not only sensible for disaster, but also helping women's economic security more broadly. So to genuinely combat economic inequality, we need to do long-term work in both increasing women's access to resources via employment, security, and income, and of course have representation at all levels of decision-making, leadership, and political engagement. Next slide, thanks. And what this looks at an individual level is to utilise trauma-informed practice. And I'm sure most people here are aware of what that is, but in terms of economic or financial services, That would mean not making people repeat their stories more than necessary, offering digestible pieces of information with clear lists, clear communication in preferred methods, and doing whatever you can to avoid overwhelm. It's also really important that we take an intersectional approach and understand that the impacts of the disaster compound with their experiences as women, which is compounded by societal barriers if you're experiencing also racial, socioeconomic, sexuality, regionality, disability, age, marital status, or migrancy status issues. And again, just to offer flexible engagement options. And of course, always offering empowering options, not punitive services. Next slide, thanks. On a policy level, what economic security would look like is women in planning in all spaces where policy and decision-making happens, both in economic spaces and disaster spaces. Long-term planning, obviously, intersectional approach, again, that all women's needs are represented. More flexible and responsive employment and HR policies within workplaces, and supporting financial capabilities amongst women, including access to affordable and appropriate insurance. And final slide, thanks. And on a cultural level, this looks like encouraging and modelling proactive engagement for women in financial matters, encouraging confidence of skills that they often already have, and likewise modelling and supporting male caretaking roles. And enabling women to ask for help and promoting it in culture, and also encouraging that from men. So that's my findings to date. And if you want to get in touch about the project, you can email me at wire. Thank you.
No, thank you, Catherine. And we'll move straight into the next presenter and hopefully get to a couple of questions at the end, if we can. So Eeva Grunden, Eeva, would you like to give us your reflections on Black Summer from a community and a recovery perspective?
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to join you in this important conversation. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I stand on and the lands that we all stand on today. Pay my deepest respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and really acknowledge the deep and lasting connection that our First Nations people have to the land and the waters. So my name's Eeva Grunden. I am working for East Gippsland Shire Council. I grew up in Mallacoota, and I was here visiting my parents when the fire event occurred, and I chose to stay. I'd only been with council for 2 months, and I've got no experience in emergency response, relief or recovery. Well, I didn't prior to then, and I've got a particular experience now. So I'm working today from the hub that Carmel referred to. I work in close partnership with the BRV team here in Mallacoota District on the ground, working very closely with the Community Recovery Committee that Carmel also mentioned in Mallacoota. That's called the Mallacoota and District Recovery Association, and there's an elected committee. So I just want to talk a little bit today about the particular experience in the Mallacoota district from my perspective. I guess one thing that I really observed is that disaster response is often portrayed as very masculine. I had that experience because I've not been involved in that space prior, but I was approached at the relief centre by someone from Victoria Police saying, you'll be coming along as the council representative to the emergency management meetings that are happening daily. And I said, oh, will I? Okay. And I was given a little bit of a warning about that, like good luck in that space. You know, it's a very masculine space. And I must say that was my experience, but I also must say I felt very welcomed and very respected, particularly given that I had no experience in the space. So I had, on the whole, actually a very good experience in that space. And I think that is a reflection that, you know, things are changing in that space, which I think is a really great thing. And that's not to say that we're on a journey and there's still lots of opportunity. I guess in that context, there were women who have told me their stories of the Black Summer bushfires in the lead up and throughout the whole experience of being very vulnerable, feeling very torn and feeling very powerless in lots of ways, in decision making and all sorts of things throughout the experience. And so, you know, I guess that really highlighted for me that gender inequality that exists in our society is there in our communities, and obviously, as previous speakers have spoken to, and previously in this webinar series have spoken to that. So, but I guess there have been some really significant changes that we've observed, say, since the Black Saturday fires, and increased understanding around those complex kind of gender and power dynamics. But I still think there's a lot, from my experience in these fires, a lot of opportunity for community to unpack some of those really complex dynamics at a really grassroots community level, just to give communities the space to really explore in their own time when they're ready. And I don't think we're quite ready for those conversations yet, but what that means, how it played out in this particular disaster, and how we could have that look differently in our community, in our context, in the next disaster, because we know there is going to be a next disaster. And I think down the track, when the community is ready, to have some space to unpack that in a very, you know, in a very nurturing way would be a great thing. Because we've talked about women's voices needing to be heard a lot more in that space, and particularly when I hear the stories from community members here, from friends and even family, talking about that experience of vulnerability and powerlessness. It's really important that we take the time at some stage to unpack that together. So look forward to that opportunity, and it needs to come at a time, obviously, when the community is ready for those conversations. They're obviously happening incidentally, but I think there's an opportunity there. So I look forward to being part of that. I think one of the core principles in disaster recovery is around understanding context. And, you know, I think there's an important context to understand, you know, it's in our society and in our communities, but particularly in remote communities of gender inequality. But I wanted to just tell a very quick story about some incredible leadership that happened here when a local member, Lynn Harwood, really stood up and led local recovery. She just acknowledged that locally led recovery does mean local people standing up and leading. And she had support from Steve Pascoe, our recovery mentor, but she brought a small group of people together and really led the establishment of the Mallacoota and District Recovery Association very, very courageously, because everybody's feeling very, very vulnerable, and to stand up into a leadership space. And I guess particularly for women, given that context, I was very inspired by, and it was such an honour to walk alongside her and that journey, and to continue to do so. I guess that was very pleasing to see that through that process, that where Lynn and that small group of people took the community along the journey, it's been very well accepted in the community. There's over 800 members in a district that's only got just over 1,000 people in it. So that's really great, and they're doing an incredible job this year of establishing a recovery plan. I just would like to sort of, I guess, acknowledge that there's been a strong theme around sense of safety in the Mallacoota district, which is incredibly obvious, I know, but I think safety just means such different things to different people. And with that gender lens, I'm really noticing that for women, the focus is around emotional and psychological safety and recovery. It's around focus on family and community, where I've really observed that for men, it's much more around those practical elements of a sense of safety, around preparation. How can we do better next time? What equipment do we need? How do we, you know? So I'm really had some interesting experiences of observing that important theme that's played out in the community and through that gender lens. I think one of the learnings for me and one of the opportunities is around really finding ways for women's strength, insights and leadership and their voices to be heard in the disaster preparedness, response, relief and recovery space. I think there's some really great learnings from the Mallacoota district community, and that is about women courageously taking up that space and finding ways to build that respect in the community, and they have been seen as real pillars in the community, which has been really exciting. So it's been an absolute honour to walk alongside this community in the journey. Lots of learnings. I could talk on for hours, but I won't. I'm really interested to hear from the other panelists today. So thanks for having me, and back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Eeva. And I think the thing that stands out is the fact that you are so positive in your reflections, and you know the struggles that people are going through, and you know that that 1.5 year period that's just passed is quite a fraught time now, and particularly with another lockdown looming. So you've got a lot on your plate still, but thank you so much, Eeva. Shona, can you give your reflections on as a high-profile organisation like Red Cross, universally known, what you've seen on the ground as well through Black Summer? Oh, I can't hear you, Shona, sorry.
Sorry, thanks, Steve. Okay. Can you hear me now? Great. So I have to say, a little intimidating to go after those three amazing women, but thank you very much for having me. And I'd first like to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the lands of the Gayamagal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and respect the incredible knowledge accumulated by First Nations people over 60,000 years of living with flood, fire, earthquakes, cyclones and dispossession. That I think there's a lot we have to learn. So I think recovery from the 2019-2020 bushfires continues, obviously, as we've heard from Eeva and Carmel and Catherine. And from experience at Red Cross, we know that year 2 is one of the hardest of recovery, and for some people, recovery will continue for many years to come. When considering how gender has factored into bushfire recovery, I sort of first reflected on my experience working in disaster recovery over the last 10 years. And for those that work in recovery know that the sort of 18 months to 2 years after any disaster is the hardest, really. Its recovery is still going at this point. We're sort of in the long middle, so to speak. So I thought perhaps maybe a better question to ask is, where are we at overall in recovery as a sector in this work that we do? And for me, on reflection, and also again listening to Carmel earlier, it seems that the conversation about gender has really changed in the emergency management sector over this time, where there wasn't sort of one at all a conversation. Now there really is. When I started in recovery was really considered the domain of the sort of pearls and twin sets. Actually had someone say that to me at a training out at Mount Macedon, a man. Recovery was and still is sort of highly feminized work. And at that point was also in many ways kind of barely considered in emergency management. Or when it was, it certainly wasn't considered as important as the more manly kind of mitigation and response work. Plenty of people before my time had been working really hard to change the perception of recovery, and I've certainly, and my colleagues have certainly benefited from that hard work. And that work, and I think also the huge shifts in our sector brought about, recovery specifically brought about by Black Saturday, including obviously the great research by Deborah and the GAD pod. And so I think we've seen a change, not in just our understanding of the gendered natures of disasters and in recovery, but in the sector's attitude to recovery more broadly. As a kind of really quick example, recently during the bushfires, actually, I was in an emergency operations centre in northern New South Wales, where I joined the daily briefings. When I joined my first meeting, I sort of took a seat at the sort of outer row of chairs around, not at the main table, because I was sort of there largely to observe and gather information. Probably says a lot about, women as well. But the kind of incident controller came up to me in his tabard, EM people love a tabard, and he introduced himself to me, and he promptly sort of invited me up to the main table because recovery starts on day 1. So times have changed clearly. And I think this change has also been reflected in the establishment of agencies like BRB, which is great. And so I think this attitude is an important, attitude shift is an important one to notice, because I've sort of noticed a similar shift in conversation around the gendered nature of disasters in the emergency management sector. It's not yet as big as being invited to the table, but we're having conferences like this, and frontline staff and volunteers are being asked to consider, think about and acknowledge the gendered impacts of disasters. And I think this is a really important and overdue shift. And, you know, listening to Carmel talk about how, you know, the values of BRV are also kind of embedding that approach is really heartening. However, I think despite the progress in our sector around how gender factors into disasters, the reality is that not much has changed in communities, unfortunately. We're still hearing and seeing about the same kind of issues and problems around increase in family and domestic violence after disasters. We're continuing to see a kind of reversion back to traditional gender roles. We're seeing vastly different disaster experiences and coping styles with women and men. I think also all of the things that Catherine was talking about in terms of economic recovery. You know, I think our reflections and learning have yet to translate to change. And I think also this is sort of hardly surprising, really, considering some of the things that have happened in our political landscape in the last year or so. But I think it's also worth acknowledging for our teams in the field, the story is really similar to those that you can read about in the GADPOD's research following Black Saturday. You know, we're hearing anecdotal reports of increased family violence and obviously undoubtedly compounded by COVID-19 and the additional pressures on families and relationships. We're seeing increased demands on women who take on kind of additional recovery tasks, both within their families, but also within their communities. In some cases, with our cash assistance program, we've seen women hesitant to spend grant money without approval from partners, and kind of money going to more sort of like manly things as opposed to family, you know, or kind of reproductive care things. Women sort of also being left with caring responsibilities for both immediate and extended family, and kind of a very much a division between men's business and women's matters in recovery. And also a reflection from a colleague was that, you know, the highly feminized nature of recovery services mean that this is potentially a barrier to men seeking recovery assistance. So while the conversations in our sector have progressed, this certainly hasn't filtered to change in men and women's experiences during and after disasters. And so I think this highlights to me that we have much more work to do, and we need to continue to build awareness of the gendered natures of disasters within the emergency management workforce, both staff and volunteers, through training like the GADPOD and others. And we need to consider how we can operationalise this knowledge and embedding practices like some of the things that Catherine mentioned. So, you know, how do we consider gender and inclusion from day one? How do we collect data? How do we provide services? How do we ensure equal access to services? And how do we enable participation of women more in community recovery, like some of the great work that's happening in Victoria that unfortunately isn't replicated in all states and territories? And just to end very quickly, hopefully on a more optimistic note, I wanted to share a brief reflection from a colleague in Queensland who has shared in some cases that recovery really allows women to be involved in tasks outside of some of the traditional gendered roles that were there in communities beforehand. And I think Eeva gave us some great examples of that in Mallacoota. So, you know, overcoming the challenges of recovery can be really empowering for some women and communities. And I think so despite the stress and pain of recovery, there's opportunity as well. So thanks, Steve.
No, thank you, Shona. What I can say is that the report that Carmel alluded to and that Eeva would have contributed to, and maybe all of the panellists, the Growing the Seeds, the VCOS and the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC report is out. It's a big file. I haven't got the link to the hyperlink, but I've got the file in front of me. But we have had a few questions, and I know we're short of time, we're virtually out of time, but I'll just pose the first question to Carmel in that, how can BRV make sure community women who take leading recovery roles are valued in more than words? I know it's kind of out there a bit, isn't it?
Yeah. So words are important, but you know, one of the things around recovery is it is about delivering real support on the ground and making a difference. So the question was about women leadership and supporting them. Is that correct? In more than words? Yeah. So keen to understand what's driving the question, but what I can say is, you know, absolutely committed to providing the supports or the partnership that works best for both men and women leaders in recovery. And we've worked to do that in very practical senses, such as setting up what we call support panels, support panel providers, so where communities may identify that they would like to apply for grants to assist their community recovery, but quite frankly, that's a pain in the bureaucratic backside. Then we've provided grant writers through a panel provision that will actually do the writing for not-for-profit organisations to take that sort of administrative burden off them. So definitely, you know, like it's actions are what matters, as is, you know, how we engage respectfully in having dialogue and the way that we listen to what is most needed on the ground.
Yeah, thanks, Carmel. It is a tricky sort of question, but the other questions we can take as comments, but someone would like to know what a recovery mentor looks like. Eeva, what Steve Pascoe, how he's presented down there and how he's mentored people, just quickly.
Oh, thanks. I guess I can only speak from my experience with Steve. He was just incredible because he's got emergency management background, but also lived experience of losing his home in Strathewen in the 2009 bushfires, and then he was a member of his community recovery committee and journey. So he had that very much lived experience and a lot of experience in emergency management. So just such a great mentor to me and to, you know, really an advocate for locally led recovery and supporting the community. And they went through such challenges that he was able to say, look, I don't think that's going to work because of this. And I think that dynamic in this community means that. And because we're all, you know, vulnerable and a bit traumatized, he was able to just bring in that sort of clarity and that's one step removed from the experience and just guide us with those practicalities, and also just really be there for us when we were like, oh, this is not working and the community's upset about this bit of it. And he would just be just so clear and so calm and bring that insight and lived experience. So yeah, he was really amazing, really made a difference to the journey.
Dave, if I could just jump in quickly and just a little plug for Red Cross. So one of my colleagues coordinates the Disaster Recovery Mentors program that Steve is a part of and on our steering committee. And so we try and connect people like Steve with communities that need some support and potentially guidance. So if anyone's interested, they can just email us at recovery@redcross.org.au and Jamie can share some other information about it if they're interested. Sorry, thank you. Had to do that.
No, that's fine. Look, we're out of time, but Catherine, I'd like to say that it's that where the research, Devon Clare's research, first started looking at the increased rates in family violence, which is the core business of women's health service providers. Obviously, it's so heartening to know that there's a whole lot of intersectionality, and the gender view is wide and diverse now, led by places like Wire and research like yours. Absolutely.
And apologies for going over time on my presentation and limiting our question time there. I thought someone would intersect. But absolutely. And I just like to remind everyone from my point of view through this research and through my other roles, often when you say gender, people just think of violence, but it's all of the equity issues around it. And as I said, you know, during my presentation, not in the event, but all the time. And it's something to be vigilant of intersectionally at all times.
Thanks, Catherine. Look, we'll close here. Susan, thumbs up if you're feeling it just a tad better after the session. You know, you can't talk. Okay. So look, we're leading straight into the final session of the conference coming up now. It's been a frantic morning. I know that, you know, we could probably sit here for another 7 days, and which we could without any sort of choice at all, but we can't. So look, I just want to thank the four of you and Susan for being on the line today. It's been invaluable. It's something that's really close to my heart, and it's quite a passion in my involvement with the GAD pod and the gender and disaster work. So thanks all for your contribution, and I'm sure that we'll be able to speak again down the track.